The royal family still refuses to talk about what King Edward VII shared with his mistresses. And no, it wasn't just scandal. Not because of the affairs themselves, but because of what he wrote to them in private letters that were later cut up, burned, or locked away for generations. They say the throne was handed down through bloodlines. But there's another inheritance that passed through the British monarchy, one written in silk and perfume, in secret letters and locked doors, in women whose names were traded in drawing rooms and then buried in unmarked histories. King Edward VII didn't just inherit a crown. He inherited a kingdom built on appearances. And while the public watched a jolly prince wave from balconies, behind the palace walls, something else was being constructed, a parallel court of mistresses, each one holding a piece of truth the monarchy couldn't afford to reveal. This isn't a story about romance. This is about power, about what happens when desire becomes currency, when secrets become weapons, and when the institution meant to represent moral authority becomes the architect of its own deception. Because buried in private collections and locked archives are letters correspondence so damaging that historians were advised to leave them untouched. Some pages were removed entirely, others were burned. And the women who wrote them? Their stories were rewritten, their voices silenced, their existence reduced to footnotes that respectable biographies skip over. But silence doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. Before we reach those letters, before we name the mistress who discovered what the palace tried to destroy, we need to understand the man these women knew. Not the king in official portraits, not the jovial Edward who charmed diplomats and opened hospitals. We need to meet the boy who grew up believing he was broken. His mother looked at him with something worse than anger. Queen Victoria looked at her eldest son with disappointment so profound it became a physical presence in every room they shared. While she adored her husband Albert with religious devotion, she saw in her son only weakness, frivolity, moral corruption. Albert Edward, they called him Bertie, learned early that love was conditional. That approval had to be earned through perfection he could never achieve. His tutors reported every minor failing. His parents dissected his character like physicians examining a diseased specimen. They didn't just want him to be good, they wanted him to be his father. And when he inevitably failed, the judgment was absolute. Albert, the prince consort, died of typhoid in December 1861. But Victoria didn't blame the fever, she blamed her son. In the months before his death, Albert had travelled to Cambridge to confront Bertie about a scandal. An actress named Nellie Clifton had been smuggled into his rooms by fellow officers. The prince consort returned from that confrontation exhausted, broken. When he died weeks later, Victoria wrote words that would haunt Bertie for decades. "I never can, or shall, look at him without a shudder." Imagine carrying that. Imagine being 19 years old and believing your existence killed your father. So what do you see when you look at him? A spoiled prince who hid behind mistresses, or a broken son who was never allowed to be anything else? The palace forced Bertie into marriage with Alexandra of Denmark, beautiful, deaf in one ear from childhood illness, and chosen specifically because she seemed malleable, unlikely to cause scandal. The wedding was less a celebration than a containment strategy. Bind him to a virtuous wife, lock him into respectability, transform the flawed prince into an acceptable king in waiting. But shame doesn't die when you try to bury it. It mutates, it finds other doors. Victoria exiled him from any real power. She kept him away from state documents, away from meaningful work, away from the very responsibilities that might have given his life structure. So Bertie filled the void with what was available: pleasure, distraction, the company of people who didn't look at him with his mother's revulsion. And women saw something different in him, not the disappointment his mother saw, not the moral failure his father had diagnosed. They saw a man desperate to be admired, willing to be generous, vulnerable in ways that powerful men rarely allowed themselves to be. This made him dangerous, because what began as consolation became compulsion. What started as rebellion against his mother's judgment became a parallel life, a shadow court where different rules applied, where his value wasn't measured by constitutional duty, but by how well he could please, how much he could give, how thoroughly he could lose himself in someone else's approval. The mistresses weren't just lovers, they became his real companions, his confidantes, the people who saw him not as a failed prince, but as a man worth knowing. Some genuinely cared for him. Others saw opportunity. A few saw both. And the palace? The palace watched, calculated, covered. Because the alternative public scandal, constitutional crisis, the collapse of carefully maintained illusions was unthinkable. So they developed protocols, unwritten rules about what could be acknowledged and what must be denied. Servants learned to be deaf and blind. Society women learned that some truths were never spoken aloud, even when everyone knew them. And the mistresses themselves? They learned that their safety depended on silence, that exposure meant exile, that the palace protected itself, not them. Nellie Clifton was first, but she was hardly the last. She was an actress already suspect in Victorian England, where theatrical women occupied a category adjacent to prostitutes in the public imagination. The young officers who smuggled her into Bertie's rooms at Curragh Camp thought they were doing their future king a favour, a bit of fun, a rite of passage. They didn't anticipate the explosion. When word reached Prince Albert, the scandal threatened everything the royal family had constructed. Not just Bertie's reputation, but the entire moral authority the monarchy claimed. Albert travelled to Cambridge in deteriorating health, confronted his son, extracted promises of reform, and then he died. Victoria never forgave the woman she believed had lured her son into sin, never forgave Bertie for allowing himself to be lured. In her mind, Nellie Clifton had killed her husband as surely as if she'd administered poison. But Nellie wasn't the cause, she was a symptom. Because even after the scandal, even after the death of his father, even after a marriage designed to contain him, Bertie didn't stop. He just became more careful, more discreet, more dependent on a network of aristocratic enablers who knew how to arrange meetings, forge alibis, keep secrets. The palace told itself this was containable, that with Alexandra as his wife and Victoria as his jailer, the damage could be limited. They were wrong. Hortense Schneider swept into London like a force of nature. She was an opera singer, a Parisian celebrity who made no secret of her liaisons with powerful men. She'd entertained Napoleon III. She'd mocked royalty in her dressing room while they waited for her attention. She was everything Victorian morality claimed to despise, and the aristocracy couldn't get enough of her. Bertie pursued her openly, recklessly, sent flowers, attended performances, visited backstage. The newspapers noticed, society noticed, his wife noticed. But what could Alexandra do? Complain publicly that her husband preferred a French opera singer's company to hers? Acknowledge what everyone already knew, that their marriage was a performance as staged as anything on Schneider's stage? She chose silence. It was the first of many times she would choose silence. The pattern was established. Bertie would stray, the palace would manage appearances, Alexandra would endure with dignity that the press praised as queenly virtue. But Schneider didn't damage him. She was too foreign, too theatrical, too obviously inappropriate to pose a real threat. The palace could dismiss her as continental excess, unserious, temporary. The women who truly endangered him were different. They were English. They were aristocratic or close enough to it. They moved in his world, knew its rules, and had their own reasons for keeping secrets right up until they didn't. Catherine Walters was known as Skittles. The nickname came from a skittle alley where she'd worked, but it stuck because it suggested playfulness, accessibility, a certain dangerous charm. She was a courtesan, though that word barely captures what she represented. Skittles was an artist of her own mythology. She rode through Hyde Park on horseback with such grace that crowds gathered just to watch. Aristocratic women copied her riding habits, her posture, her style, even as they pretended to be scandalized by her profession. Bertie was fascinated. More than that, he was publicly associated with her in ways that made the palace deeply uneasy, because Skittles wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed or explained away. She was too visible, too admired, too entangled with respectable society, but she was also smart enough to know the limits of her power. She kept Bertie's letters, she kept evidence, but she never weaponized it, never pushed beyond what the system could tolerate. She understood that her survival depended on being valuable but not threatening, visible but not destructive. Skittles was a warning the palace didn't fully heed. She proved that Bertie's appetites couldn't be contained through marriage or maternal disapproval. She proved that he would pursue what he wanted regardless of public judgment. And she proved that some women in his orbit were calculating enough to protect themselves. But calculation only works when everyone follows the rules. And the next woman in Bertie's life didn't follow any rules at all. When Lady Harriet Mordaunt's husband found letters from the Prince of Wales in his wife's possession, the careful architecture of denial collapsed. This wasn't a foreign actress or a famous courtesan. This was the wife of a member of Parliament, a woman from respectable society. And when Sir Charles Mordaunt filed for divorce, citing adultery, Bertie's name was central to the scandal. Harriet told her husband things that horrified him, that she'd been with other men, that her newborn child might not be his. She seemed desperate, unraveling, confessing to everything and nothing, begging forgiveness while implicating herself further. The doctors who examined her declared her insane, a convenient diagnosis. Because if Harriet was mad, her testimony was worthless. If she was mad, the letters could be explained as delusion. If she was mad, the scandal could be contained through commitment rather than confrontation. But the case went to trial anyway, and Bertie was summoned to testify. Imagine the scene. The future King of England in a witness box, hand on a Bible, swearing an oath before God and country. Asked directly whether he had committed adultery with Lady Mordaunt. Answering no. Lying, almost certainly lying, but doing so under oath because the alternative was unthinkable. The jury found Harriet insane. She was committed to an asylum where she would spend decades, her sanity debated by doctors who had every incentive to keep her locked away. Her child was taken from her. Her voice was silenced. And Bertie walked free, his reputation damaged but intact, protected by the testimony he'd given and the diagnosis that made Harriet's words meaningless. The palace had survived, but barely, and it had learned something it could never admit in public. They'd learned something crucial. The mistresses weren't just personal indulgences. They were existential threats. Any one of them could bring down not just a man, but an institution. So they adapted. They became more careful about which women were acceptable, which situations could be managed, which scandals could be buried before they reached daylight. But there was one woman coming who would expose the limits of even the palace's most sophisticated damage control. One woman who understood power better than Bertie ever did. One woman who would take what she knew and transform it into leverage that would haunt the monarchy for generations. Her name was about to enter his life, and nothing would ever be the same. The trial destroyed what little privacy the royal family still controlled. Newspapers printed every detail. Political cartoons mocked the prince. Victorian morality, that rigid code the monarchy claimed to embody, was revealed as a performance maintained for the lower classes, while the aristocracy operated by entirely different rules. Bertie's popularity plummeted. When he appeared in public, he was booed. The man who would be king was jeered in the streets of his own capital. His mother refused to grant him meaningful responsibilities, still convinced he was morally unfit. His wife maintained her dignified silence. That particular brand of suffering the palace would later repackage as devotion. But here's what the palace understood. Public memory is short when carefully managed. Scandals fade if you give people enough time and enough distraction. The key was ensuring the next liaison was more carefully orchestrated, the next mistress more trustworthy, the next secret better kept. They didn't realize they were simply building a more sophisticated trap. And what happened next is the part historians still argue about in private. Because the next mistress didn't just share his bed, she slipped into the space between bedroom and cabinet room, where gossip turns into policy. Jennie Jerome arrived in England as an American heiress, the kind of transatlantic money that British aristocracy both needed and resented. She was beautiful, ambitious, and she'd married Lord Randolph Churchill, a marriage that gave her social position but not satisfaction. Lord Randolph was often absent, politically obsessed, and their relationship was more alliance than romance. When she met Bertie, something ignited that was different from his other affairs. Jennie was intellectual. She hosted salons where political power was brokered through conversation rather than formal channels. She understood that influence worked through networks, through information, through knowing what powerful men wanted before they asked for it. Their affair was never publicly confirmed, but it didn't need to be. Everyone in their circle knew. The letters she wrote were coded, designed to be meaningless to outsiders, but clear to Bertie. She signed them with symbols rather than names. She dated them vaguely. She was constructing deniability even as she preserved evidence. Because Jennie understood something crucial. These relationships weren't just personal, they were political. The prince shared things with his mistresses that he couldn't share with his mother or his ministers. State secrets, personal frustrations, opinions about foreign policy and domestic politics. The pillow talk of princes is the intelligence gold that topples governments. She never used what she knew directly. That would have been crude, obvious, dangerous. Instead, she advised her husband. She connected people who needed connecting. She became invaluable not through direct power, but through her position at the intersection of royal access and political ambition. The palace watched this and worried. Not because Jennie was scandalous, she was too smart for scandal. They worried because she was competent, because she transformed Bertie's weakness into her strength, because she proved that a clever woman with royal access could build power that no constitutional document would ever acknowledge. But Jennie knew when to step back. She never pushed too far. She maintained the performance of respectability even as everyone knew the truth. Her son, Winston, would grow up watching this dance between public virtue and private reality, learning lessons about power that would shape his own political career. If Jennie was controlled danger, Daisy Greville was chaos barely contained. The Countess of Warwick entered Bertie's life as a beautiful aristocrat with expensive tastes and insufficient funds. She was young, spoiled, and accustomed to getting what she wanted. When she wanted the Prince of Wales, she pursued him with the same determination she applied to acquiring jewelry she couldn't afford. Their affair lasted years. Bertie showered her with gifts, attention, access. He wrote her letters that were embarrassingly earnest, emotionally exposed in ways that gave Daisy leverage she initially didn't know how to use. But time changes people. Daisy's beauty faded. Her debts mounted. Her position in society became precarious as younger women captured attention she'd once commanded. And she looked at the letters she'd kept, Bertie's letters, written in his own hand, signed with intimate endearments, and saw a solution. She threatened to publish them unless the palace paid her debts. This was different from anything the palace had faced before. This wasn't a scandal that could be managed through doctors' diagnoses or clever testimony. This was blackmail, explicit and mercenary. And Daisy had nothing to lose. She'd already been marginalized socially. The very reputation the palace might threaten to destroy was already damaged beyond repair. Edward was king by then. The Victorian era had ended with his mother's death, and he'd finally claimed the throne he'd waited decades to inherit. He was in his 60s, overweight, his health declining, and a former mistress was threatening to expose letters that would humiliate him, damage the monarchy, confirm every moral failure his mother had predicted. The palace negotiated. They paid some of her debts. They convinced her that publication would destroy her as thoroughly as it would damage Edward. They weaponized her children's reputations, her remaining social connections, everything she still valued. And eventually, she backed down. But the letters weren't destroyed. She kept them. Evidence, insurance, proof that she'd been powerful once, that the king himself had loved her, that she'd mattered. Here's what that moment revealed. The mistresses weren't just victims of royal exploitation. Some of them were players in their own right, manipulating the same system that attempted to manipulate them. The power dynamic wasn't as simple as powerful man, powerless woman. It was more complex, more dangerous, more difficult to control. Because information is currency, and women who lacked formal power learned to accumulate and deploy informal power instead. They collected letters, they observed political conversations. They befriended each other, creating networks the palace couldn't fully map. They understood that their value lasted only as long as they were useful or silent, so some chose to remain useful, and others refused to remain silent. The palace called this blackmail. The women might have called it survival. The truth probably lived somewhere between those words, in the complicated space where exploitation and agency coexist, where victims can also be architects of their own leverage. If you had those letters in your hands, proof a king had used you, proof the palace wanted you gone, would you burn them or use them? Alice Keppel was different. She entered Edward's life when he was already king, already aging, already aware that his time was limited. She was married to a man who understood and accepted the arrangement. She was discreet, intelligent, and she genuinely seemed to care for Edward beyond what he could give her. The Queen Alexandra, long-suffering Alexandra, actually trusted Alice. She recognized that Alice kept Edward alive longer than he might have survived otherwise. Alice monitored his diet when he wouldn't listen to doctors. She managed his moods when depression threatened to consume him. She became a sort of auxiliary wife, handling the emotional labor that Alexandra either couldn't or wouldn't provide. But Alice was also documenting everything. She kept correspondence, she noted conversations, and she understood that her position was precarious, dependent entirely on Edward's continued favor and existence. When he died, she would have nothing except what she'd preserved. Edward's death in 1910 was expected but still devastating. He'd struggled with bronchitis for years. His obesity made every illness more dangerous. When the end came, Alice was there. So was Alexandra. The two women who'd shared him in different ways both attended his final hours. And then came the scramble. Alice attempted to secure letters, documents, anything that would preserve her connection to the king or provide for her future. The new king, George V, despised her. He saw her as the symbol of his father's moral failures, the visible reminder of everything he intended to do differently. He wanted her erased from royal history, her presence at his father's deathbed forgotten, her years of influence denied. The palace began collecting Edward's correspondence. They went through his private rooms, his secure boxes, his hidden drawers. They found letters from mistresses spanning decades, political correspondence that referenced intimate relationships, notes that revealed how much influence these women had wielded over royal decisions. And they made a choice. Destroy what was too dangerous to preserve, lock away what might someday need to be proven false, and remove entirely any documents that would confirm the palace's worst fears. But here's what they discovered as they sorted through Edward's life in paper form. Some letters were already missing. Alice had taken some. Daisy had kept others. Copies existed that they couldn't locate. And there were references in correspondence to conversations that, if fully documented, would expose not just Edward's personal failings, but potential constitutional violations. Because Edward hadn't just shared gossip with his mistresses, he'd discussed policy, he'd revealed diplomatic strategies. He'd complained about his mother's interference in ways that suggested she'd violated the very constitutional limitations she claimed to uphold. The private Edward had said things the public king never could, and those words, preserved in intimate letters to women who existed outside official channels, were dynamite. The royal archivists made a list. Documents to be destroyed immediately, documents to be sealed for multiple generations, documents to be edited before eventual release, and documents that were so sensitive they were to be mentioned only in the most oblique terms, with instructions that future researchers should be discouraged from pursuing those particular threads. This wasn't just about protecting Edward's reputation. This was about protecting the institutional monarchy itself. Because, if the public understood how much influence these mistresses had wielded, how much royal policy had been shaped in bedrooms rather than council chambers, the entire fiction of constitutional monarchy would collapse. The throne was supposed to reign, not rule. The monarch was supposed to be ceremonial, apolitical, advisory at most. But Edward had never been just ceremonial. He'd manipulated, influenced, deployed his relationships to shape outcomes. And he'd shared that process with women who had no constitutional standing whatsoever. So the palace built an official history. In that version, Edward was a jolly king who'd sown some wild oats in youth but settled into dignified monarchy. His mistresses were mentioned obliquely if at all, their influence minimized, their intelligence insulted. Alice became the king's friend. Daisy became a footnote about Edwardian excess. Jennie disappeared into her son's much larger shadow. The letters that might have told different truths were sealed away. The women who might have challenged that narrative were either dead, silenced by social pressure, or bought off with sufficient money and threats to ensure their cooperation. History was scrubbed clean. Not erased, that would have been too obvious, but sanitized, made safe, transformed into something the monarchy could survive. But documents have a way of resurfacing. Archives eventually open, and some truths refuse to stay buried. Historians who tried to access those sealed files reported something strange. They weren't simply denied access, they were discouraged from asking. Archivists would suggest other, more fruitful research directions. Senior scholars would advise younger researchers that certain lines of inquiry were career-limiting. The message was clear, without ever being stated explicitly. Some truths about Edward VII were still too dangerous to acknowledge. What made those particular documents so threatening? What could possibly justify keeping papers sealed more than a century after the events they described? The answer isn't in what was kept, it's in what was removed. When researchers finally gained access to some correspondence in the late 20th century, they found letters with sections cut out. Precise, clean removal. Someone had taken scissors or a razor to pages and excised specific paragraphs while leaving the rest intact. This wasn't accidental damage, this was surgical censorship. What remained were references to the missing sections. A sentence that began mid-thought. A response to something that was no longer there. A reference to what we discussed about the Irish situation with the discussion itself removed. A mention of the agreement regarding the German negotiations with no explanation of what agreement or whose agreement or what Edward had promised. These gaps revealed a pattern. Edward had been conducting his own shadow foreign policy, using his mistresses as intermediaries, making promises the British government might not have authorized. His mother had excluded him from official state business, so he'd created unofficial channels. And those channels ran through women whose only constitutional role was to not exist officially. This was worse than sexual scandal. This was potential treason, or close enough that the palace couldn't risk letting it be examined too closely. Most people will go their entire lives thinking this was just another king with mistresses story. It's not. If you're one of the few who actually wants to hear what the archives tried to bury, hit subscribe now, so this kind of history doesn't get sanitized into fairy tales again. Alice Keppel had emigrated to Italy after Edward's death. She lived comfortably, never quite rich enough to be secure, but never desperate enough to sell what she knew. She died in 1947, and her possessions included locked boxes she'd instructed her daughters never to open, never to discuss, never to surrender to any official inquiry. One of those daughters was Sonia Keppel, the other was Violet Trefusis. Both knew their mother had been the king's mistress. Both knew there were secrets that outlived Edward by decades. And both, in different ways, chose silence. Sonia's daughter would later become Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla. The bloodline of royal mistresses weaving into the contemporary monarchy itself. The boxes were eventually destroyed, burned, according to family accounts. What was in them, we'll never know with certainty. But the fact that Alice felt they needed to be preserved in secret and then destroyed rather than archived tells us everything about their contents. Daisy Greville outlived Edward by more than 30 years. She'd transformed from aristocrat to socialist, written memoirs that hinted at her relationship with the king but never quite confessed it fully. She'd been marginalized, mocked, reduced to a cautionary tale about women who overreached, but she'd kept copies of some letters, and in her final years, impoverished and bitter, she'd given interviews where she suggested that what the public knew about Edward was sanitized fiction, that the real king had been more complex, more politically engaged, more willing to use his position to influence outcomes than constitutional history acknowledged. Historians dismissed her. She was old, unreliable, obviously resentful. Her testimony was filed away as the ramblings of a woman whose relevance had long since expired. But what if she wasn't rambling? What if she was simply the only one willing to speak a truth that everyone else had agreed to bury? The pattern repeats throughout history. Powerful men have relationships that exist outside official structures. Those relationships create channels of influence that formal institutions can't control. And when those men die or fall from power, the first instinct is always to erase the women, to minimize their intelligence, to pretend they were merely decorative rather than functional. Edward VII's mistresses were dismissed as symptoms of his weakness. But what if they were actually evidence of his strength? What if his ability to build and maintain these parallel networks of influence was precisely what made him effective in the limited role his mother permitted him? The official story says Edward was frivolous, that he wasted his years as Prince of Wales on pleasure and distraction. But the hidden story, the one preserved in fragments and gaps and carefully avoided research topics, suggests something different. That Edward built a shadow court with real power, that he used personal relationships to conduct diplomacy his mother forbade, that he shaped outcomes through pillow talk that was far more calculated than the palace ever wanted to acknowledge. And the women? They weren't passive participants. They were politicians without portfolios, diplomats without credentials, power brokers whose influence operated entirely off the official record. We want history to be clean. We want kings to be either good or bad, mistresses to be either victims or villains, institutions to be either honorable or corrupt. But Edward VII's story refuses those simple categories. He was a man damaged by impossible expectations, who damaged others in turn. He was manipulated by his mother and manipulative toward the women in his life. He was kept from meaningful work and created meaningful work through illegitimate channels. He was both victim and perpetrator, both sympathetic and reprehensible. The mistresses were exploited by a system that gave them no official power and built power through the only channels available to them. They were both used and using, both harmed and harmful, both trapped by circumstance and surprisingly free within those constraints. And the monarchy? The monarchy did what it always does. It survived. It protected itself by protecting its secrets. It maintained public confidence by hiding private truth. It sacrificed individual women to preserve institutional legitimacy. Those missing pages from Edward's letters will probably never surface now. Too much time has passed. Too many people with direct knowledge have died. The documents themselves have likely been destroyed or degraded beyond recovery. But their absence is more revealing than their presence could ever be. Because we know they existed. We know they were important enough to remove. We know that what Edward wrote to his mistresses, what he promised them, what he revealed to them, was dangerous enough that the palace chose permanent suppression over temporary embarrassment. That absence is the real scandal. Not that a king had mistresses, that's barely noteworthy in the long history of monarchy, but that those mistresses mattered enough, knew enough, influenced enough that evidence of their impact had to be surgically removed from history. When we tour Buckingham Palace or watch contemporary royal weddings, we're looking at an institution that survived by controlling its story. The walls that separate public from private, official from personal, acceptable from forbidden, those walls were built and maintained through exactly the kind of suppression that erased Edward's mistresses from official history. Camilla stands as queen now, great-great-granddaughter of Alice Keppel, living proof that those bloodlines never really disappeared, they just waited long enough for the scandal to fade into quaintness. The palace that once hid Alice's influence now celebrates her descendant. The institution adapts, always. But adaptation isn't the same as honesty, and survival isn't the same as justice. Harriet Mordaunt died in an asylum in 1906, declared insane for 40 years, her child taken, her voice silenced, her testimony dismissed as madness. We'll never know if she was actually unstable or simply inconvenient. The diagnosis served its purpose. It protected Edward and destroyed her. Daisy Greville died alone in 1938, the woman who'd once blackmailed a king reduced to poverty and irrelevance. Her threats hadn't been empty, but the palace had called her bluff successfully. She'd kept her letters, but they'd kept her isolated. Alice Keppel died in 1947, having burned the boxes that might have rewritten royal history. She chose family over truth, protection over revelation. Perhaps she was wise, perhaps she was complicit, perhaps those aren't different things. And Jennie Jerome, she died in 1921, having launched her son Winston toward the power she'd never been allowed to claim officially. She'd understood the game better than almost anyone. You build power through others. You influence without claiming credit. You matter by making yourself indispensable rather than demanding recognition. The throne doesn't just pass through bloodlines. It passes through silence, through agreements about what will be acknowledged and what will be buried, through women whose names were famous in their time and then carefully forgotten, through letters that were written and then destroyed, leaving only the ghost of what might have been proven. King Edward VII died, believing his mother had been wrong about him. He'd been king for less than a decade, but he'd been preparing for the role his entire adult life, not through the constitutional study Victoria had denied him, but through the parallel education his mistresses had provided. He'd learned diplomacy in bedrooms and drawing rooms. He'd built influence through personal relationships. He'd discovered that informal power could be more effective than formal authority. And when he died, the palace dismantled everything he'd built. They erased the networks, silenced the women, hid the evidence. They reduced his reign to ceremonial functions and his mistresses to moral failures. They protected the institution by destroying the truth. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the knowledge that it happened. That behind every official history is an unofficial truth. That the women the palace tried to hide were real, were intelligent, were influential. That power works in ways constitutional documents never acknowledge. The palace walls still stand, the monarchy still reigns, the secrets are still kept, if more carefully now, if with more sophisticated public relations. The game hasn't changed, just the players and how visible they're allowed to be. And somewhere, in some private collection or forgotten archive, those missing pages might still exist. 2 pages that could rewrite not just Edward's story, but our understanding of how power actually operates behind the performance of constitutional rule. They probably don't exist anymore. They were probably destroyed long ago by someone who understood exactly how dangerous truth can be. But the fact that we don't know, that's the point. The uncertainty is the real secret the palace wanted to protect. Not what Edward did, but what we'll never be allowed to know for certain. That's the inheritance that passed down through the British monarchy. Not just a crown, but the knowledge of how to hide what the crown protects. Not just power, but the understanding that sometimes keeping secrets is more powerful than any truth could ever be. And that lesson? That one's never been forgotten. Most channels will keep serving you the polished version, the official story, with all the teeth pulled out. This one doesn't. If you want to hear the next secret before it's softened, buried, or spun into something harmless, you know what to do.